chance to talk in my own community, in my own hometown. So the reason I'm talking to you all tonight is because this is what I teach about at UCSF. I'm an associate professor at the Wheel School of Neurosciences, which is the new name for the Department of Psychiatry, and I'm now volunteer faculty. I just left and started an anxiety-focused practice. But that's in Mill Valley, and this is my hometown. And teaching is my great love, and I teach about one thing and one thing only, which is fear and anxiety and how the brain manages these emotions. So first, before we get started, I just want to do a quick thank you to the women who made this talk possible. So Susie, Abby, and Dina, thank you so much for putting this on and other talks and parental education programs like it in our school district and in our community. I go to many of them and enjoy them greatly. So the question, the sort of existential question that I want to ask you all tonight is, are we in a crisis of anxiety? Are we really seeing more anxiety now than we ever have? And interestingly, it looks like, at least from a measurement standpoint, the answer is yes. So over the past 80 or 90 years, surveys have been tracking symptoms of anxiety. Didn't necessarily call it, language changes, anxiety back 80 to 90 years ago, but asked things like difficulty sleeping or feeling on edge or worrying. And it seems like the adult population in the United States has been reporting this more and more and more over the past decade. We're now at the point where about 29% of the adult population reported a lifetime prevalence, meaning at some point in their life they had experienced symptoms that met criteria for an anxiety disorder. And that was actually about 15 years ago, because the last national comorbidity survey that went out of 9,000 Americans was between the years 2001 and 2003. So it may even be higher. Which begs the question, if that many people meet criteria for an anxiety disorder, is anxiety disorder a disorder? And I think we're going to touch on that question tonight. I don't think anyone can actually answer that question. Certainly anxiety itself is not a disorder. All of us have experienced anxiety. It's a very important role in our lives. So I like to show this picture to point out what's fear for and what's anxiety for. So fear is what we feel when we're managing an imminent threat. Feel fear. Anxiety is future threat. And what's interesting about anxiety is it's sophisticated. So we don't really know the consciousness of animals. We can't really ask them about it. But what we do know is that anxiety is certainly requiring more conscious awareness than fear. That's because to feel anxiety, you have to have memories. You have to have an understanding of past threats. You have to have the consciousness to imagine a future and apply to that future potential future threats. So it's kind of like running outcome models all the time in your brain to be anxious. And I'll give you an outcome model that I ran through before I came here tonight, which is, I have a big talk at Drake. I talk a lot, but actually talking to your hometown is extremely anxiety-producing compared to talking to a bunch of medical students who may or may not be listening, and where you've already had the stamp of authority on your forehead, and you're coming up to the front of the classroom and you don't really know them. So tonight, and for the days leading up to tonight, I felt some anxiety, and the anxiety was about that possible outcome model. I could blow this talk. But that motivated me to prepare for this talk, which gave me some increased control, right? This is anxiety working optimally, and humans love control. So we are crushing it at survival right now. If you have not noticed it, if you're comparing us to other apex predators, we're not even really an apex predator. Like, other animals would eat us if given the opportunity. We do not have claws, we do not have sharp teeth, we're not especially strong, We're not especially fast, but we are crushing it at survival. And why is that? Because we are quite intelligent and we are quite driven to control our environment. Some of us are driven to control our environment to the point of certainty. Some of us love certainty. And that fuels what I'm going to talk about next, which is high IU, meaning you have a high intolerance of uncertainty. Does anyone here have a high intolerance of uncertainty? I definitely do. So high IU will actually take the fun out of fun things if you're not certain what's going to happen. Otherwise known as being a control freak. So here's what happens when you have high IU and you have a big talk at Drake. So first you get anxious, but this makes you feel out of control. Anxiety feels like something that you would like to control because you would like to control all facets of your life, including your emotional life. And this loss of control over your anxiety makes you feel anxious, right? So now you're not anxious about the talk as much as you're anxious about controlling your anxiety about the talk. And the fact that you can't control your anxiety and you start to get this second idea, like maybe anxiety will actually get in the way of doing the talk. Maybe anxiety won't let me sleep tonight. Maybe anxiety will make me embarrass myself in front of this room of people who I love and know and see at school all the time. And so then you start to have anxiety about just what anxiety does to you, and now you have completed the loop. This is looping, okay? This is fear of fear. And this is really the characteristic that I look for when people come for treating anxieties. Anxiety still, just kind of, this is high stakes, this matters, I'm going to prepare, I'm going to motivate myself. Anxiety is a non-pathological emotion. Where it starts to get in our way, where it starts to torture us, is where we're looping. This is what looping feels like, right? We would do anything to get out of that storm. And we actually have an excellent way to get out of that storm that I'm going to tell you about tonight, which is you get anxiety and forget getting anxious about it. Just get certain that this is the outcome, right? Has anyone done this? Has anyone just started looping and then said, oh, I can't take this anymore? I've just decided my fate, right? So if you really can't get out of your fate, like if it's happening to you, if it's the result of a pathology test or something that is unavoidable, this might be where you go with that doomed fate you've decided for yourself. If you can get out of it, awesome. This is where you can go, right? You can just not show up. So resignation and avoidance relieve anxiety like nobody's business, And we've all experienced this. It brings control and certainty and immediate relief, right? It also brings the entirety of problems related to anxiety. So when you find yourself looping and your only way out is to resign yourself to the idea of being doomed, or to avoid the thing that initiated the anxiety in the first place, you are paying a very, very high cost for anxiety. So resignation is really the first step toward developing hopelessness, worthlessness, and depression, and I see this all the time as sort of a stepping stone to becoming more impaired than an anxiety disorder would normally impair you. Likewise, avoidance, isolation, people will start to avoid a test, they'll move into avoiding a class, they'll move into avoiding school entirely. The extreme of this is that people become so overwhelmed by the day-to-day and so feeling as if they need to control their anxiety before they step out that door that they stop stepping out the door. So how can we regain control and certainty? Well, first of all, you have to shift your focus completely from hoping for certain outcomes. Drop that fantasy now. I don't care what kind of parents you had. I don't care if your boss says, I'm not an effort kind of lady, I'm a results kind of lady. She can't control that, and neither can you. You have to shift your focus from outcome to action. So you can control action, and this is like a switch that you flip in your brain, but if only it were so easy. You have to flip it 100 times a day. You have to catch yourself focused on a particular outcome and looping around the anxiety related to a particular outcome, and instead you say, I relinquish control over that outcome. I have no certainty over that outcome. The only thing I am certain of is this particular action. Now this is a very hot topic because it underlies a major shift from what we call fixed mindset to growth mindset. Has anyone heard of that recently? It's really taking off in the school system because people realize, oh, if we give this idea to kids early on, they'll be like, I'm not going to sweat whether or not I fail that test. I'm going to go home and study because it's a good chance for me to learn the words and see just how well I can do if I throw my whole effort into this. But we haven't, many of us, we have not been raised that way. Most of us, I would say. I certainly wasn't raised that way. I had very loving, compassionate parents, and it was all about outcome, right? So to shift into a growth mindset takes great effort, and we will talk later about how the effort to grow a growth mindset actually makes your brain grow. No joke, so it's kind of fun. You can remember it that way. I like to compare some of these elements of growth mindset and psychological health in general to physical fitness. So the pursuit of mental fitness, right? We pay a lot of attention to physical fitness. Even if we're not doing it, we feel like we should do it. We feel like it's something that healthy people are doing. And we completely neglect mental fitness. And if you look at this slide, you can see that actually the things that I've listed up here, quickness, responsiveness, endurance, strength, flexibility, balance, and recovering from setbacks like an injury. There are excellent parallels for all of these in mental health. So if we think about being very responsive to changes in your environment, if we think about being able to stick through something like the entire 4 years of college, even if sometimes it's absolutely miserable or you're lonely, strength, so managing a huge traumatic event that just came up in your life that you did not see coming. Flexibility, so the ability to switch out of a kind of more rigid mindset and some patterns that you've used your whole life that have gotten you to a certain point, but now you need some different patterns, like the whole growth mindset shift. That takes a lot of flexibility. Balance is really, the parallel would be tolerating that whole range of human emotions. So not being frightened or upset by being frightened or upset, by not being upset that you get mad, upset that you get embarrassed, right? Really having that balance in your life, that being human means you experience a very wide range of emotions. And lastly, this recovery from setbacks is that other hot button topic that's out there right now, resilience. So that's, we give a whole talk about resilience, but today we're focused all on fear and anxiety. So any of you in this room who were born with an anxious temperament, like myself, you have one thing already going for you when it comes to psychological fitness. You are super responsive to changes in your environment. You are like, bam, I'm there, I'm on it, something changed, I noticed. So why might that be an advantage, right? This guy, and who is this guy? Does anyone know what this is? Yeah, this is Smilodon. And Smilodon, does anyone know where Smilodon was native to when Smilodon was crawling around? Yeah, right here, yes, right, in California. So I love to show this slide because it always reminds us, oh yeah, being very responsive to things in our environment does have, its advantages. Maybe it was genetically preserved for a reason. So let's talk about our threat response for a second. Okay, so we see Smilodon, then our sensory system sees Smilodon. Maybe we smell and hear Smilodon. All right, then we feel afraid, and then we have the threat response, right? Anyone? Is this right? This is what I learned. This is what, honestly, I learned as of just a few years ago. This is what I can still remember teaching at the medical school, but this is wrong. This is what actually happens. Okay, there's a threat, and our sensory system picks up on this threat. Bam, threat response. You didn't even think about it. You just acted, right? Humans act before they think. The sooner we realize this, the sooner a lot of ills will probably be managed differently that go on in human interactions. I mean, acting before we think sets us up for all sorts of life-saving scenarios. It also gets us into a lot of trouble, but we do it. So where is fear in the picture? Down here. So all this red stuff, like the red and orange and pink, I tried to label it hot colors, because it's hot, it's just fast, and it like burns through you. The cool colors, this is your attentional system. This is consciousness. Consciousness says, apparently, the sensory system has identified a threat. I think we should be afraid of this. This is like nanoseconds later, but when it comes to signaling in the brain, this is like way slow and relaxed and calm compared to threat response. And then what is fear's job? Is it to do this threat response? Anyone? Fear is a teacher. This is fear's job. Fear teaches us what we should be afraid of in the future. And this top threat response stuff happens so fast that sometimes what scares us, honestly, what gets the attention of the attentional system, is not even the threat. It's the threat response. This is how fast the threat response is. And if it's really powerful, that's what's going to grab your attention. That's what's going to make you feel afraid. So my threat response is super powerful. This is my threat response, and this is a threat response of probably anyone who's really wired to be vulnerable to developing an anxiety disorder. One of the things that I want everyone here to understand is that people who develop anxiety disorders tend to have a very quick threat response system. They are wired that way, okay? If you have that, you are like a sports performance vehicle. This is how high performance and responsive you are. Now, anyone who looks at this car thinks, oh, I want to drive that car. Anyone who's never driven a car like that and gets in that car realizes, oh, I don't know how to drive a car like this, right? Because it's so responsive, it has a sport suspension. If you go over an acorn, it feels like you actually ran over someone on the road. If you make a sharp turn and you oversteer, you're like, whoa, right? Because you're not used to driving a car like this. Anxious people are used to driving a car like this. I call it sport suspension on life's bumpy road. And I love telling people with anxiety disorders this is how they're wired, because it really drives home the message. It's not pathological to be wired this way. It's part of the variation that we see in human temperament. But what is it that's actually the engine of this car? What is the body's experience of sensitivity and sports performance and tight springs and sport suspension? So it's the sympathetic nervous system, right over here. And it is so poorly named because it saves us from a lot of stuff, but in the most unsympathetic way possible. It's torturous. So you'll recognize a lot of these symptoms. Like, I have a glass of water up here because of this. And the biggest thing I want you to pay attention to is what the sympathetic nervous system does to the heart. I mean, the heart and fear are like this. They are buddies. And so when you're experiencing a threat and your sympathetic nervous system goes into overdrive, your heart rate increases, and something else called contractility, which is just how strong your heart is pumping, and you feel this. And this is where I said, a lot of the times what causes fear is a threat response. It's not even the threat to begin with. It's actually, this really makes us feel uncomfortable. Did my laser pointer seriously just, oh no, okay. And then, interestingly, there's some other, I think fear is cool, so I'll tell you about this. Like down here, the liver, I can't, okay, there we go. My laser pointer's not working. So, release of glucose by liver, what does that do? Gives you like a jolt of sugar in your bloodstream. And you get release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are actually just other words in the US for adrenaline and noradrenaline. It relaxes your bladder so you can lighten your load, and it contracts your rectum because it actually takes longer to lighten that load, so you just run with it. And then this is what's happening simultaneously in the brain. So you've got that stuff all happening automatically. And then you've got this slower, contemplative, conscious process of experiencing fear, and you're learning this was a threat. Okay, so we're here in fear and memory, fear conditioning. That's what this is called. So whenever you hear that tag phrase, fear conditioning, this is just Pavlovian conditioning, but unlike exposing the animal to repeated experiences, and then they learn, oh, I associate food with a bell. No, when you learn about fear, boom, you learn it once. No flashcards, no study guides. Fear conditioning is some of the most extraordinary learning that the brain can do. If you think of something scary that happened to you, or something scary that happened to the world, something really significant, you will remember what you ate for breakfast. You will remember the order of the day. You will remember every little bit of the context that happened around that event. And that is because your brain is trying to teach you everything it can about how to avoid this threat in the future. And sometimes it is so dead wrong. I never tell patient stories, but this guy had such a good story that I asked him, can I use this story in a talk? And he said yes, because it's really good. So this story is called Surf Date. So I saw a guy who is this charismatic, fit, outdoorsy tech guy who has to give public talks all the time and does not identify himself as anxious, but does say he's always been very intense and type A. And he likes to take dates surfing. So he went on a surf date. And this is what happened. They got some sun, they got kind of maybe a little too much sun. They were exerting themselves all day surfing. He didn't eat lunch. And he was excited. So he got in the car, and they were going to drive back to the city. And all of a sudden, he started feeling really lightheaded. His heart started pounding really hard. His vision went to tunnel vision, and he pulled over, and he said, I don't know what's happening to me, but I think you need to take me to the ER. So he went to the ER. He was sweaty and white, and they took him in there, and they ran all these cardiac exams on him, and they were like, we think this is a panic attack. And he was like, well, yeah, I did get super dehydrated and overheated. I never had one before, but I guess if this is the time. So yeah, he had low blood sugar, low blood volume, all sorts of triggers for the sympathetic nervous system to say something wrong was going on. This is where that signaling happened. So this is a really super stylized picture of the amygdala, which is out in front, and is shaped like it's about the size of an almond, and it's kind of shaped like an almond. And then right behind it, the hippocampus. Hippocampus is actually called hippocampus because it looks just like a seahorse, which is the Greek word for seahorse, so very stylized here. And what happens is the amygdala serves as sort of the threat relay station. It gets a lot of signaling from your sympathetic nervous system, and it says threat response, says there was a threat. And then, it may have gotten cues from the eyes, seen the threat, smelled the threat, heard the threat. And then the hippocampus says, okay, where are we? And when did this happen? It is the contextual memory, or plays a big role, I should say, in contextual memory of threat response. And this is what went kind of funny in Surf Date. So when this guy went to pick up his date the next time, he drove up to her house, and she got in the car. Guess what happened? He had a panic attack, right? He had a panic attack the minute she sat down in the passenger seat. Because his brain was like, we've been surfing before, we have skipped lunch before, something horrible happened, we're not sure what it was probably that woman, right? That's just what his brain did. That's how fear conditioning works. It's so right so much of the time, but when it's wrong, it really reveals kind of how flimsy it can be. But you have to, this is what I really say to patients, respect the fear response, okay? Just give it its due. It is doing its best to protect you, even when it's not always right. But don't respect it so much that you always believe it. Whether it's, getting on an airplane, you don't have to believe it. Whether it's going on a date, you don't have to believe it. Sitting down to take a test, you don't have to believe it. But respect that it's trying to protect you from things that could kill you. That's why it's there. And you get to decide, this isn't going to kill me. So another little piece that I want to show you guys about the kind of automatic functioning of the threat response that I think really illustrates it is just what it's doing all the time without even asking upper management to help it out, without even letting us know it's just managing threats. So say you are on the trip of a lifetime and you're trekking in like the Himalayas or the Andes and you meet someone who's from the area and he's walking backwards along this path where there's a 1,500-foot drop and he's saying, and this up here is a sacred site of, and what are you thinking as you're watching this guy walk backwards along the hiking trail? You're like, oh God, please don't walk backwards and please get away from the edge, right? In fact, you're worried about your safety, you're worried about everyone's safety. The edge is so much on your mind, but he seems so relaxed. All right, so fear and anxiety don't exist without attention. So this guy's not really attending to where he is, or is he? Part of his brain is, and this is where we get into like the existential question of consciousness. Part of his brain knows where he is. It knows that if he started to slip, it knows where the drop is. He grew up there, right? Take him into a different context. Now he's coming to visit you, and you grew up in the city, and you're walking backwards on the sidewalk, and trucks are roaring by you like death machines. And you're talking to him about this environment, and you're asking him to trust you that, every 100 meters or so, you guys are going to walk into the path of these death machines. He's never seen traffic lights before. This is like a totally foreign environment. And you're super calm, and you realize that this guy is on edge, right? Because so much of threat appraisal and threat management is going on outside of our conscious awareness, we don't even give it credit. It's so contextual. And the example that I like to use is I love to listen to hip-hop. I like to listen to hip-hop in the kitchen. I like to listen to it while I'm driving or working out. And when I'm in the kitchen, I can listen to this song and think, oh, I love this song. I can't wait to play it on the drive. And I'm driving, and that song comes up, and I'm like, where's that siren coming? Who's on my tail? And oh my gosh, I can't see the car. Is it a police car? Is it an ambulance? Should I pull over? Wait, this song has a siren in it? The minute I got in the car, right, my attentional system just automatically shifted. It's not like I got in the car thinking while driving, I must be aware of sirens. It did that for me. So the brain is constantly doing stuff for us that we're not even aware of, and the impact that this has on how we manage fear is huge. So if you have an anxious temperament, this is what you're threatening all the time, but certainly when there's a threat. And this is what fear gives back to your threat response system. Fear actually tells your threat response system, we should ramp up this response because this threat is major. But where did it get that message? From your threat response, right? This is like the physiologic underpinning of cognitive looping. We talk about this anxiety of anxiety. This is what's happening at a physiologic level. This is what's going on chemically and neurologically, where your neurons are sending little signals to each other. And these little red dots down here are like cortisol, norepinephrine, all of these stress hormones released when you feel afraid. So, and then memory. You can also, this last little underappreciated arrow down here, you can say, oh, I remember the last time this happened. We should really be afraid, right? And this, now you're in like, this is the storm right here. Okay, so this is a test of your emergency response system. This is only a test, but I'm going to show you some pictures that are quite triggering for some people. No gore, I promise, but I'm a little serious that I just warn people. Because some threats we don't need to remember. Okay? Yeah. So I had an good. Anyone else kind of like, yeah. All right, how about this? This isn't as scary as when you're sitting in a chair, but yeah, how about this? So the reason I put this in, because my snake coiled for attack elicited a panic attack in a med student last time I gave this a talk. So now I show this guy, but you can use your imagination. All right, so for all of you who are like, yeah, that does not really faze me at all. You liar, it does, you just don't know it. So your threat response system, your sympathetic nervous system, if we were to take your heart rate, if we were to measure skin conductance, which is how sweaty your palms are, there would be little minute but measurable changes, and we know this because we test people who just aren't aware that they're having it, they deny at the wazoo, no, I'm really not feeling anxious, but they're sweaty and their heart is pounding. No, honestly, it's subtle. It's subtle. So they're not feeling anxious, but their threat response system is activated. So what's interesting about these fears is that they tend to be these very evolutionarily appropriate fears, but not so appropriate for modern life. This slide might be a little bit harder to see, but we kind of progress developmentally through some of these fears that are really appropriate to stage of development. So separation from our parents, we get really freaked out when we're infants and strangers. We get really worried about stuff like animals and spiders and darkness and thunder and lightning, and we start to develop real imagination at this point. This is really where anxiety starts to grow, because we can imagine a future and we can imagine creatures that we've never even heard of yet. Getting ill, germs, natural disasters, stuff you see on the news. School-age kids are really subject to getting anxiety from the news. We start to get a little performance anxiety in here, and then in adolescence, this is like just so intense, the worry about peer rejection. And I love to tell this story about some friends who are here tonight. We all went on a ski trip together, and we were in the hot tub, and one of my friends said, we're all up here, did we lock the doors? Like, the kids are all asleep downstairs, could someone just sneak in? And my other friend was like, seriously, that's where your brain goes when we're in this hot tub? I'm just thinking, like, when's the last time they cleaned this hot tub? Could I get pseudomonas from this hot tub? Am I gonna get, like, folliculitis? Who sat in this hot tub? And I said, oh, I'm just worried I'm gonna say something dumb and you guys aren't gonna be my friends anymore, right? You just march through the stages of specific phobias. So these are what we call prepared fears. We really don't need threat exposure memory to have them, which tells us something amazing not only about our brains, but also about the genetics of fear and anxiety, because these exist before memory and we share them with other primates, and some of them are pretty darn ancient. And really, like, not that, I mean, there's stuff we should really have phobias of in the modern era, and we don't, because it's just not really genetically hardwired. So that brings me to the second kind of stage of this talk, which is talking about how do we transmit anxiety. So anxiety is super, super, super heritable. It is passed on. I mean, if you look at someone with anxiety, if you look at me and my husband, I look at our 3 girls and I'm like, you are gonna sunburn and you have like 100% chance of being kind of tightly wound. I'm sorry about that. So Jerome Kagan did this study in, I think it was sort of mid-90s of a lot of different babies. Actually, I take that back. It's not the mid-90s. It's 1989. 1989, he still was very much of the mind that all humans are created equal and that early childhood experience really makes us who we are. And this was a very popular idea at the time. And it's a very appealing idea, too, that we come to the table sort of fresh human beings. And we do to an extent, except we also just inherit a ton. And so he started doing these experiments on infants, really horrible experiments. No, they weren't that fun. But showing infants very novel things, like a kind of intense mobile bell, having them smell rubbing alcohol, and then he and his team looked at the reaction of the infants, and infants had various reactions, like, oh, cool, or like, oh my God, right? And infants communicate, oh my God, with a lot of physical, very stereotyped physical behaviors, like flapping their arms, or turning away, or kicking their legs, or crying. And so this is what they saw and measured, and they were able to divide kids into these 3 major groups. So any parent in here, when I put this up and I'm like, yeah, he thought maybe we were all born with the same temperament. They're like, right? If you have more than one kid, they're like, no, they are not all born with the same temperament. So what they found was, wow, babies are really different. So about 40% of them were very chill babies. And I never had those. And 40% of them were kind of somewhere in the middle, and 20% of them were high reactive. And I tease my kids about stuff, but behind their back, I call them the itchy tag baby, right? Where it's like, what's wrong, oh God, she won't go to sleep, oh, it's the tag, right? You would just chase, what could possibly be activating this kid who's super activated. So when you follow these kids, and they did, they're still following them now, they're in their late 20s, what they found was around age 7-ish, when they took another sort of marker for temperament, they found that 50% of the high reactive kids had become anxious kids, like really anxious kids with some pretty significant social shyness, fear of dogs, throwing up when they got really stressed or overwhelmed about getting up to talk in front of the class, that kind of stuff. And then they kept following them. And so what do you expect happened to these kids? Right? They're totally hosed, right? They were not. They were actually not at all. These grew up to be some of the most successful kids, the high reactive kids, which was really interesting. So not all anxiety and not all impairment can be linked to this temperament, but it certainly does set us up. It certainly does increase our risk for developing anxiety, but we don't all develop an anxiety disorder. A lot of these kids were running for class president, in plays, on sports teams. They also had some very interesting personality characteristics, which is why I treat people with anxiety disorders, because this is the most marvelous thing about the anxious temperament. It seems to co-sort with being highly conscientious, very detail-oriented, driven, risk-avoidant, and very self-controlled. When I treat people with anxiety disorders, they are not sociopaths, all right? And we'll touch on that a little bit later. But these kids that Kagan was looking at, it seemed like they had honestly walked some sort of a tightrope. They had very anxious temperaments. A lot of them reported things like, I still throw up before tests. Or I really am worried. My friends don't like me. I worry about it all the time. I keep hanging out with them. Yes, I do, because I love them. And so these kids, it's like they had figured out how to drive their sports performance vehicle. So they wanted to figure out what is it, especially about the kids who were the most high reactive and seemed to now be the most successful. And so Carl Schwartz, who was a colleague of Kagan's, did this follow-up study with MRI, and he looked specifically to see if there were things that kind of popped out about the MRIs of these kids. And what they found was an area in the front of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, that was thicker than you see in your average person. Which is interesting, because the prefrontal cortex had been implicated in anxiety response before. People thought, oh, when you're anxious, your amygdala lights up, and also your prefrontal cortex, so it plays some role in fear. But the question is, what role was it playing? Was it causing fear, or was it doing something else? If it grew the most in these kids who seem to have mastered their fear, what did that mean? So it means we actually need our prefrontal cortex to do this, reappraisal, which is like just a fancy psychological word for kind of catching ourselves and focused on outcome and moving ourselves more into behavior, moving ourselves more into action. So the example that I have here is Homer is studying, and the idea crosses his mind when he's freaking out late at night and he's looping and he's like anxious and he's not going to sleep. He's like, I'm going to fail. Right? So he has this thought. This is his automatic appraisal because his threat response system is super activated and he's thinking fearful thoughts. And then he thinks, maybe if I just show up, I might pass. I might graduate with my friends. And so he does. He makes himself show up. It takes a great amount of effort. And it also requires this reappraisal. It requires this possibility. So constant reappraisal as a habit, catching yourself and really, really driving your conscious brain into reappraising this catastrophic outcome that you've imagined, into reappraising this idea that you're doomed to fail, and saying, no, I might fail, but I should still show up and do my best, right? This sounds so basic, but it's not. I do this all the time. I catch myself constantly catastrophizing, thinking that I'm doomed about something and having to challenge that. And every time I do, it's causing some stimulation of neural connection in my brain. Now, neurons talk to each other between these little things called synapses. Guess how many neurons your average neuron is talking to? Guess it's the size of its social network. One cell. 38,000. So one little cell in your brain is talking to 38,000 other little cells in your brain. And you have like over 1 billion neurons per square inch. The connectivity of your brain is incredible. And when you make it more connected through activities like reappraisal in the prefrontal cortex, you can see the prefrontal cortex actually grow as if you were lifting weights. But you can actually get the benefits of reappraisal right away. You don't even have to make this like a principled forever life existence. You can just kind of see the results immediately and see the reward immediately. And I'll give you an example of this. So Wendy Mendez, who's now at UCSF, was at Harvard when she did this study, and she grabbed a whole bunch of kids going in to take the GRE at Harvard, and to half of them she said, after this test, I'd like to do a survey on the performance impact of anxiety on test taking. And then the other half, she said, after this test, I'd like to do a survey on the performance-enhancing impact of anxiety on test taking. Catch that, right? So the one half, it was like, let's see how your anxiety affects performance, and the other half, it was, let's see how anxiety enhances your performance. That was it. So they went in right away. This was like outside the door. She was saying this to them. They were like, okay, whatever. Yeah, I'm about to take the GRE. Practice GRE. So it was practice GRE. And they did 50 points better on that test right there than the other group. And then 4 months later, that group did 65 points better than the previous group. No other interaction. The survey afterwards was just like, how did you think you did on the exam? Because the real test was, if we prompt people with this reappraisal of the impact of anxiety on performance, will it impact performance? Yes. If you think anxiety positively impacts performance, it positively impacts performance. And this is what like sports performance coaches use, right? Anytime they're trying to psych people up, they're like, you're charged up, you're ready. People who have to go on stage know this. If you can get yourself into the mindset that you're excited and activated and that it's normal to be afraid, you charge in there with all of your threat response hormones surging through, and you're not in flight mode and you're not in freeze mode, you're in fight mode. And it can be a very, pacifist kind of fight. You could be giving a comedy performance, but you're in a different mindset. So now we're gonna kind of shift gears. Like, why do we need reappraisal in the first place? And why do we need anxiety? And why are they sort of duking it out for our loyalty? Because we've always had to answer this question, not what is this animal. I think it's a mechalodon. It's like an ancient rodent, all right? But let's say you're hungry and you see that guy, and then you see Smilodon, right? Where did your hunger go? Yeah, it's gone. But actually, your body still needs food. It's under there somewhere. It's going to come back. So you're tackling this existential question: do I approach the food? Do I avoid the food? There's no right answer. If you approach, you have opportunity, but you have the risk of being eaten, right? You could eat, but you could be eaten. If you avoid, you're safe, but there's an opportunity cost, right? In economics, opportunity cost is the cost of the opportunity that you didn't take, which in this case is that you're going to go hungry. So when I talk about control and certainty, if you think about human populations over like the past millions and millions of years, we've been getting increased control over our environment, which means we have more resources, which really shifts the balance of survival advantage from approach to avoid. And I want you to think about that for a second. As we get more resources, it does not make sense to take risks. And I'm not talking about like an immediate, you're starting to make money, so you become less risk prone. I'm talking about genetically, like whose genes survive. Is it the person who, even though there are like 80 rats over there, you see Smilodon and you're like, I'm gonna get that rat. That guy, not at a survival advantage, right? The other interesting thing about anxious temperament over millennia is that these traits of caution and avoidance and risk aversion and detail-oriented and striving for control not only benefit the individual, we are social animals. If you're living in a social group and it has a lot of cautious people in it working together, you might be very uncomfortable. There might be a lot of anxiety floating around, but you are probably going to survive. And we are very, very social animals. And so I want to talk about the last kind of interesting thing as we talk about how evolved we are, which is also how primal we are. So when you look at birds responding in a social group to threat, they do so with amazing quickness. It's beautiful to watch, right? A bird will move away from a hawk, and the next bird moves away from the hawk, and it happens so fast. The threat response is so coordinated that it's really hard to even perceive of where it generated. A bird is sending a message to the whole flock, I'm shifting away from a threat, and the whole flock says, we are too. And it's that instant kind of threat response. So this brings me to the social importance of threat contagion, right? This is where you're responding to a threat you can't even see, hear, smell, or know is there. You have no conscious awareness of it, but other people around you are exhibiting a threat response to it, and you are too. And this is what I think is so cool. This is what I always want to teach at the med school, but it's not, as much pharmacology and that kind of stuff. But okay, flock of birds, this happens. Herd of elk, school of fish, we've all seen this. Here is a flock of people responding to threat contagion. This is kind of a joke, but not really, because actually the study that really piques our interest about threat contagion was this study outside of SUNY Stony Brook. Dr. Majika Parady studied people who were skydiving. And she had a bunch of skydiving volunteers wear sweat pads under their armpits. And then she had a bunch of the same volunteers wear them under their armpits while they worked out. And another day, she made sure she matched up the time and the duration. So time of day matters, cortisol levels, and all sorts of other things that we might be communicating in sweat, believe it or not. But duration was interesting. So she had people wear sweat pads as they were rising up in the plane, as they were free falling, and then as they were floating afterwards. Now, skydiving, when you're in tandem, is not a very exertional activity. Nevertheless, those sweat pads were quite full. And running on a treadmill, not a very fear sweat, not a very threat sweat, we'll call it, inducing activity. Then she compared the two by asking a whole other set of lucky volunteers to smell the sweat pads. And people were like, no, I really can't tell what's fear sweat. I'm sure some people said so, and maybe some people could. But most people were like, it smells like sweat. It smells pretty gross, right? That's conscious perception. I kept asking them, but who's afraid? Which pad is threat sweat? Non-conscious perception, you could measure heart rate increase, you could measure skin conductance increase for the people who were smelling the threat sweat. Nothing changed when they smelled exertional sweat. And if you image their brains as part of the amygdala, left amygdala, which is a place in the primate brain responsible for processing threat hormones, it lit up. exertional sweat. Did not light that up. This is not the only threat contagion that humans are wired to experience at a non-conscious level, and I really want to drive that home. What I'm not talking about is how much this activates us consciously. I mean, this, we smell sweat on someone in a non-exertional standpoint. Like if you're in a meeting and you smell sweat on someone, you're like, they must be freaking out because they smell like sweat, but we're not in the gym, right? So when you do perceive of these things, yes, you'll have a conscious awareness, but what is magical is that you're also processing them instantaneously at a non-conscious level, and we can measure it by your amygdala lighting up. So human screams will light up your amygdala like that before you're even aware that you heard it. And the way in which they do this seems to have something to do with a quality called roughness, which is the oscillation, very rapid oscillation of volume, like 150 times per second. A screen is like, but super sped up. And it has this kind of discordant roughness that's very unique, although we hear it in alarm signaling in animals as well. And actually, inadvertently, when people make alarm sounds, if they're like, oh, this is the sound that's going to get people's attention, what scientists found is they go back and test those sounds, they have a quality of roughness. So this unique sonic property of roughness, we hear it, and our sensory system just sends it straight. It's like, oh, that's roughness. Go right to the non-conscious threat response. Don't even bother with attention. Just, it's roughness. And we're ready. Last cue. All right, a visual threat contagion. Does this make anyone feel uncomfortable? Yeah, right? The human fear face is a visual threat contagion. We have an automatic threat response to it. Our sympathetic nervous system turns on. You might not notice it, but we could measure it. And yes, your left amygdala lights up when you see a fear face. Your left amygdala actually seems to play a role in processing the visual cue of how much sclera you are seeing and direction of gaze. That's how much white of the eyes you're seeing. Your amygdala is like, that much, that much, that much? Okay, we've reached fear, right? And it's like that. You're not even aware of it. Which picture makes you guys feel more uncomfortable? The one on the right. Anyone intuitively gonna guess on why that might be? It's a child, yes. And that's a big confounder that I put up here. Anything else about her gaze that's different from the other guy's gaze? She's looking at a place that's not at us. So when we see a fear face that's looking directly at us, we're like, they're afraid of us. And we're like, should be afraid of me, right? It's actually kind of a submissive signaling that goes on. When you see someone who's looking at you with a fear face and it's just over your shoulder, you do not react calmly. You can try this at a party. If you go up to someone and you're like, they will look around, and then they'll be like, what? What did you see? What? Right? They are ready. It's like the flock of birds. We are more like birds than you would ever guess. And this is the coolest piece of all. When we smell threat sweat, or we hear a scream, or we see someone's fear face, do you know what we do with our face for a few nanoseconds that's hard to capture? We go like that. Yeah, I would pass it on, right? So this is like hardwired in us. Why does this matter? I mean, we can't really help it. But if this is a little kid who has to get a shot for something, and she's in the doctor's office, and she's freaking out, look at the doctor's face, right? So a lot of signaling happens. We're constantly attending to people's faces. We're constantly attending to the people around us. If Wendy Mendez did this other great study where she took moms and she gave them this fake job interview type scenario where the interviewers were actually like super rude and mean and contemptuous. And the moms walked out to be reunited with their infants, and they tested their heart rate and their cortisol levels, and guess what? Within a few minutes, the heart rate and cortisol levels of their infants mirrored that of their mothers. Very, very quickly. So we can't really help it, But it's good to know that this is happening when you're a social animal. So this brings me to my next question. If we've been evolving over the past couple million years to share threats with one another in this super primal way, about 1.75 million years ago, I just had to look this up, we started making tools. And archaeologists think that that's around the time when we started using really complex language. And that's probably around the time where we didn't even need to smell fear on each other. We could just be like, okay, here are like 10 things that you should be seriously freaked out about right now, when we were sitting around making tools together. How do we communicate fear now? Right? This is my favorite one. I had to actually Google fear-mongering news, and this won the prize. This absolutely won the prize. So my advice is avoid news with a feed. That's if they've got a feed, they're after your fear. And when other people teach us about fear, it has a fancy name. Instead of calling it fear conditioning, we call it vicarious fear conditioning. Right? So turn off superfluous sources of vicarious fear conditioning is my one first thing that I tell people who are really suffering from anxiety. You don't need to watch the news. If you go after the news, if you use your prefrontal cortex top down to be in control of news you want to read, you're I want to learn about this thing. That's a great response. It doesn't want to waste a lot of energy on a threat response. So you can build tone in the parasympathetic nervous system, and you can get more control over your physical threat response. So we're talking about, tackling some cognitions that you have through reappraisal, moving into this growth mindset, and actually, you can tackle your bodily response to threat too, that non-conscious stuff, and we'll talk about how. How is not avoidance. So avoidance drops you right off this curve, feels instantly relieving, but it robs you of this. And when you're doing this, first of all, this is where all of that growth in the prefrontal cortex is taking place as you come down from fear. This is also where your parasympathetic nervous system is practicing again and again and again. This is how we slow the heart rate when we get agitated. Now, everybody wants this, right? This is ooh, that scared me, but I'm over it. And how do we get there? We build parasympathetic tone. And it is not easy, but it is doable, and there are some very effective ways to do it. So one of them is aerobic exercise, but not just any aerobic exercise. It actually appears that you really want to get your heart rate to a point that you get your heart rate when you're freaking out about something. So you can actually probably spend less time exercising, but do more intense intervals. This is kind of hot right now also for health and weight loss and stuff, but HIIT workouts, and also because we're just all really, really busy. So you can work out for 15 or 20 minutes, and if you do intervals where you're I'm running upstairs, or I'm going on a bike with the resistance all the way cranked up, or you play a basketball game, or you play a soccer game, you're running, and then you're when you're doing that second piece, your parasympathetic nervous system is I'm gonna bring it back down, because we might have to run again, right? So what you want to do is on that arc of fear response, you want to treat exercise, and you want to go laser. You want to go up and then down, and then up and then down, and then up and then down, as much as you can. And you can do that really quickly, and it has a really profound effect on your parasympathetic tone, and you will notice this in things do I wake up in the morning feeling slightly calmer? Am I sleeping slightly better? Do I feel slightly less reactive to stressors? This is not going to take fear and anxiety away, but it's going to give you a sense of physical control over it. I saw a bumper sticker that I love, which said, "I run to burn the crazy off." And I was you go. So takeaway points from this, and then we have a half an hour for questions, because that's actually a pretty fun part. And so anyone who doesn't like discussion questions
you are welcome to take off. I won't be insulted, but I do want to leave some time for people to ask questions about all sorts of stuff, because there's so much to talk about, and I want to know what this audience wants to talk about. But my 7 pointers to walk away with, no joke, like, you know, you're like an X-Men. You are a magnificent product of evolution. If you have anxiety, you were evolved to have anxiety. It is part of you. You are wired that way. Think of it as your sports performance vehicle, however you want, but know that it is part of how you were wired at the level of the genetic code and your nervous system, and you might as well start learning how to drive it. Don't let it drive you. And this is this shift in focus from outcome to action. None of us can control outcomes with any certainty. Not a single soul in the universe can control outcomes, but we can all control action and effort. Discuss your anxiety with others. Avoid people who tell you, oh, you shouldn't be afraid of that. That's a stupid thing to be afraid of, which people do say. But discuss it with people who will say, yeah, I get crazy anxious too. Because probably at least, you know, I would say 1/3 of people you know suffer from fairly significant anxiety and just might not talk about it. It warmed my heart when before the Super Bowl, they were going through all the guys who played in past Super Bowls, and they were like, you try and pretend it's just like any other game, but you're freaking out. And the Eagles guard, Brandon Brooks, if any of you guys know about him, he throws up before every game. And he came out and did a real outreach about just how impairing his anxiety was when it would cause him to avoid games. And now he's like, I just throw up, and I laugh about it, and I go play the game. All right. Model resisting avoidance and resignation. So this is a big one for kids. So in our house, we talk a lot about how, yes, that is scary, and it is uncomfortable. And we're going to do it anyway. There's no shame in the fear and discomfort at all. But it's all about like the action, the effort, sticking to things, and really labeling avoidance as something to be wary of. You know, and what I will talk about with young adults too is that substances of abuse in an anxious population are very often a method of avoidance. The fear is so intense that they want something that instantly takes it away. And there are even prescribed medications that instantly take it away. And I don't, want to get into a whole pharmacotherapy discussion necessarily tonight before you guys ask questions about that. But be wary of medications that instantly take fear away. There are other medications like antidepressants, which get prescribed a lot for anxiety, which just bring that fear curve down. Still go through it, but it's not to quite the same peak. But anything that drops you off that fear curve entirely does not build your resilience, and you become very easily dependent on it at a neurochemical level, and I can talk more about why that is. And then don't invite vicarious conditioning. This is when it sounds easier than it actually is to like stop looking at your news feed or stop watching the news, but I really do advise this. The news is not a way to be informed. There are ways to be informed that you have more control than clickbait and the evening news. And then build parasympathetic tone, hit. The other thing which I really didn't go into, but yoga, practicing yoga teaches your body and brain how to tap into parasympathetic activation in the moment. So I'm terrible at yoga because I just think of like shopping lists and stuff, and I can't block out the day. But people who are able to meditate, are able to engage in a yoga practice, there are other practices that are similar in engaging the parasympathetic nervous system. They really teach you to go into that zone, teach you how to control breathing, teach you how to activate your vagus nerve, which is the big nerve that comes down and controls heart rate and breathing rate and everything else. Yoga doesn't necessarily like build parasympathetic tone the way a HIIT workout will. It just teaches you how to get there. If you do both of them combined, you're like mastering it. Recognize that anxiety is a prerequisite of courage. So my favorite quote ever was from Game of Thrones, the first episode, like in the first 5 minutes, where the young child Bran asks his older half-brother, after they see something pretty traumatic, can a man be brave if he's afraid? And his brother says, that's the only time a man can brave. And that really resonated with me. So thank you all so much for coming tonight. I have to include the kid pictures. And do we, you can just start asking questions too if you want to. Hi.
Hi. I wanted to know how diet can help or hurt anxiety.
Oh, that's such a great and loaded question. I wanted to include some stuff about diet because I do have recommendations for diet. So if you think about things like our panicky surfer guy, so letting your blood sugar get low. So thinking about things that kind of help your body maintain what we call homeostasis. So it's sort of like a balanced set point. So what I will often recommend for people who wake up very anxious is eat a snack that's high in fat and protein, where during the course of the night, your blood sugar won't bottom out, which means you won't wake up at 3 p.m. feeling kind of panicky and agitated when really what it is activation of your sympathetic nervous system, that you're hungry and you have low blood sugar. But diet brings up a whole other question that I did have in there around evolution, which is, we're all filled with symbiotic organisms. And all of our gut flora that live in us, they're doing all these cool studies now. And these are not like kind of out there studies. These are like NIMH studies about how gut flora influences behavior, especially fear-based behavior. Which begs this question, if we are eating a diet that reflects a lifestyle where we have a lot of resources, and our gut flora as our symbiotes are also, passing on their own genes about influencing their hosts, it would behoove them to foster caution in their hosts. And so there's a lot of questions like, when we're eating a lot of sugar and carbs and sort of stuff we eat when we're in the land of plenty, how does this affect our gut flora? How does gut flora affect our tendency to avoid? In rats, if you feed them particular kinds of foods that induce a particular kind of gut flora to grow, they won't leave the dark part of the maze, or they won't walk out into the center. These are how we sort of measure threat response in mice and rats. It's like, will they leave the dark and will they cross into the center of the maze, or do they just stay right on the edge? And that kind of behavior, you can shift their diet, measure a shift in their gut flora, or even just shift their gut flora by giving them transplants of another mouse's gut flora. We won't go into the details. And they'll behave differently around anxiety. So yeah, diet, I don't know what to eat. Eat healthy, but it does seem to play a role. Yeah. Yes.
What specific behaviors would you define as anxious behaviors in small children?
Oh, anxious behaviors in small children. That's a great question. I think all children will exhibit anxious behaviors. So avoiding things they're scared of, ruminating about things they're scared of, like asking you a dozen times, but what if there's a monster under my bed? How can you guarantee there's not a monster under my bed? And can you put the light on? And that is all within the realm of normal. It's when it becomes impairing. So in psychiatry, in psychology, we're really labeling disorders by degree of impairment, which is, bringing us back to that question in the beginning, is anxiety a disorder, and what's an anxiety disorder? Because we usually use these sort of arbitrary cutoffs, like spends 2 hours a day doing this, or doesn't get out of the house. And so what you're really looking at is to figure out how impairing the anxious behaviors are. Anxious behaviors that kids exhibit are a lot of separation anxiety related stuff, so wanting to stay right close by our side, having impulsive, kind of impulse control behaviors like nervous habits, like nail biting or hair pulling, scab picking. I mean, these are all things we see in most kids at some point, and it's really like, does it get to the degree where it's hurting or harming the kid's day-to-day quality of life? I hope that answer is kind of a vague answer, but. Oh, yes.
Okay, so thanks for your talk. It's been really informative. I have kind of a teen brain on my head, and I'm thinking of going back to the space where you're talking about the prefrontal cortex, which, to my understanding, is not fully developed until you're in your
Yes.
20s.
Yes.
And it's the risk, emotion, impulsive center for teens.
Yep.
And I'm combining that thinking with your slide on how you can almost sort of like develop the muscle in the brain, or you make the thickening of the brain by
Yes.
reappraisal process.
Yes.
Can you say a little bit more about that process specific to teens and how they can work to that? And is that possible considering that their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed or is
Yes.
in the development?
I'm so glad you mentioned that because I actually forgot to mention that at that slide. So the prefrontal cortex develops, all kids are different, but we kind of pick like 25 is when we think it probably reaches maturity. So yeah, teens are far, far away from developing the full extent of their potential impulse control. And so how can teens work with an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex? Well, it's the same way that we would look at like a child athlete versus an adult athlete, that you can still grow and develop a skill set even as you're a child, even as you might not be able to compete with your adult self. You're laying the foundation of that from the get-go. You're also laying the foundation of habits that will make it easier for you to develop those prefrontal cortex strengths around reappraisal. But to your question, teens are so limbically driven, the limbic system being our emotional response, and they don't have that kind of slow down that the rest of us do fully developed yet. I think what it points out too is, what I advise for teens is like the same kind of exercises that we use for adults, but for parents of teens, really being mindful of the fact that the teen brain is still not developed with regard to impulse control. So really being mindful of the access that teens have to things like social media and substances. A big one that comes up for me is teens and substances, and what should I worry about my teen using and not using. And if you have an underdeveloped brain with regard to impulse control and you're using substances for avoidance, you're so much more vulnerable than an adult, and adults are vulnerable enough. So I think the shift around teens is really that they still need to be parented, even though it's also developmentally appropriate for them to reject every effort on our part to parent them. So, and I don't even have teens yet, but I will have 3 daughters aged 2.5 years apart, all under the same roof at the same time, so I'm studying up.
My question is about physical response to anxiety. My daughter, she's 10, and when she gets anxious, she gets itchy. Like she says, my body feels itchy and I can't put the clothes on. And I'm wondering if there's a way to help her train her brain to lessen that response.
That is a really interesting question, and I actually have to say, I don't know much about that, but it is a thing because there is a whole subset of psychiatry and dermatology called psychodermatology, which is about the reaction of the skin specifically to stressful events, like getting hives. It's not just even that someone is experiencing the somatic sensation of itching, but actually that their body is reacting in an inflammatory way to stress. And so that I wish that I knew the answer to that, because it exists, but it's not within my wheelhouse of what I would recommend.
Yes, I was just wondering, you spoke about cognitive reappraisal and the neocortex. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about tolerating anxiety and exposure. 'Cause I think that's another aspect that would be good to, because with some people would think that, and parents also, that, well, they should be somehow just reappraising it, but actually, there's such a place for anxiety where you'd have to, in order to be resilient, you'd have to learn to tolerate a certain level.
Yes, and I think, if the point of my talk today, if sort of the take-home message is to depathologize the way that we think of anxiety, which is really about not being afraid to experience it. And so, the reason that I really pound home depathologizing anxiety is so that people can be more tolerant of anxiety. And if we are less afraid of it, we can tolerate it as something that is uncomfortable but not harmful. And exactly to your point, whenever people get treatment for specific phobias, for example, they need to engage in exposure. And exposure is how we get down the other side of that fear curve if we think about a stereotype predictable response to something that always freaks us out. What we need to do is the opposite of fear conditioning, which is fear extinction. When you learn to be afraid of something and it takes that one instantaneous exposure, how many times do you think you need to learn it's not a threat? There's no answer. It's really dependent on the individual, but it is many times you need to learn it's not a threat. It's also something you need to maintain regularly. You will never forget that is a threat. That connection is there in your brain forever. What you will build around it is the memory that it's not a threat too. Right? So your brain will still remember, whoa, wait, I have exposed myself to this thing 100 times and it has not harmed me. I will always remember that I'm scared of it, but I will also remember that I don't have to be scared of it. And you need to tolerate anxiety in order to go through that fear conditioning or fear extinction process of exposure.
I have a three-part question. Number one, what sort of things do you do to help kids in your practice work through, live with anxiety? Number one. Number two, what can parents do to help their kids and teens working through it, deal with anxiety? And number three, could you also talk a little bit about CBT?
Yes. So I don't treat kids. I am an adult psychiatrist. So I'm going back to how I dealt with, and I did treat kids in my training. One of my favorite tools, which now may be updated, is, before you even said talk about CBT, it's a CBT tool for kids called Coping Cat. It depathologizes anxiety for kids. So it takes them through, you have a kid sit there and talk about everything that goes on in their body when they feel anxious. And then you have them label scenarios where that might be helpful and why it exists. So the first thing that you're helping them do is to understand why that threat response exists. And then you're engaging in the same kind of techniques that I touched on here, which are reappraisal of situations that have caused them fear, getting them to expose themselves very incrementally to situations that cause them fear, really letting them control the gradation of exposures. That is cognitive behavioral therapy. That you want to change some of the cognitions oriented around fear, and then you want to change the behaviors. And I think for parents with kids, really, some of the, talking about anxiety as a normal response and depathologizing it is huge. And I think we can all do that. We all kind of get the gist of that it's not pathological to experience anxiety. Remembering not to vicariously condition your child around their anxiety. So when your child is anxious and having a poor tolerance to their anxiety, that you don't say, you know what we're going to do, because anxiety is intolerable, we are going to take you away from whatever's causing the anxiety. That is what loving parents do all the time, is that they create a scenario where they work around the child's anxiety to the point that the anxiety encroaches on the kid and the kid becomes more and more avoidant. So really lovingly modeling avoidance is the dangerous thing, and not the uncomfortable anxiety is the dangerous thing.
these are our last two.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
I just wanted to build off of that a little because I have one. She's now 12, but she's had massive anxiety for the past 2 years and severe fears. And I'm always trying to straddle what am I enabling versus what am I trying to redirect. Because I feel as though sometimes my constant understanding may be enabling it, and then my husband thinks that we shouldn't engage in it because then that just perpetuates it. So trying to figure out what's the balance of acknowledging and accepting, and we're going to do it anyway, and then also acknowledging it, I guess.
Yeah, and I think we all struggle with the same thing and struggle with the sort of consistent approach to it, because there are some times where you just feel really unempathic as a parent, and that's not a great experience for your kid to have. And then there are other times where you really want to put a foot down because you're feeling really resentful about the kid's anxiety, and then that makes you feel guilty, and then so you and it's, it's very anxiety provoking for parents to have a kid who's struggling with anxiety. What I think can be very helpful is talking about the struggle with the kid and just saying, as your parent, I know it's my job to always watch out for an opportunity for avoidance because I know that's going to really perpetuate the anxiety. At the same time, I feel like a monster when I tell you that you have to do something that I know is, causing that storm for you. And so I think really explicitly talking to kids about the challenge that you're going through with them so that you can engage them too in signaling I have young adults in my practice who will say I told my mom, I've got to do this, and you've got to make me do this, and I'm not going to want to do it. And it's interesting when kids kind of know, it's almost like some of the other structure that we put in place for them. They know they should go to bed. They're going to do everything they can to not go to bed, especially if they have fear of the dark, that kind of thing. And yet we still hold firm, and they experience that as creating a place of safety. So I think it's always I'm making my kid do something really uncomfortable. At the same time, I want to talk to them about how it's important because this creates safety for them. Does that make sense?
I have the last question, I guess. And I'm way in the back. Thanks for coming to the back of the room. And this room is filled with people who are so interested and engaged in what you have to say. So I want to start by thanking you for bringing your expertise, your compassion, and your experience to all of us, because I think we're really, really grateful that you're here.
Thanks,
Question about the football player that you mentioned. So it sounds like he's really okay with puking before games. But if he were someone working with you, would your goal be to get him to a place so he's not throwing up before games, or get him to a place of being compassionate to himself and well, I'm a guy who pukes, then I play football? What would be your goal in working with him?
Definitely the second option. So he went from a place of avoiding games and going to a clinic and getting an IV because he was throwing up so much and lying to teammates about what it was. He had a sense that this was related to anxiety, but it was very difficult for him to discuss in the culture of a football team. And what he was able to do was get it to where he was throwing up less. This is like an article I read last night, so I may not get it just right, but and accepting that he will throw up before games. And he actually, to your point, said that. He said, I throw up and I laugh. I know I'm going to throw up every time. And so I think it's really about, and this comes back to the tolerating it. So tolerating that you're going to loop, accepting in a compassionate way that you're going to loop, an acceptance of emotional experience and not getting on yourself for being an anxious person is that's the starting point. And I hope that's why my approach tonight, which is, I'm not just the president of the Hair Club for Men, I'm also a customer. When I talk about my own anxiety with patients, I think you guys are of a certain generation if you know that commercial. And if you're just looking at me, likely that you were not watching television in 1986 or so. But you know, talking about having compassion for having significant anxiety around stressors and not feeling shame about it and not trying to really change the anxiety itself, if that makes any sense. And I hope what I kind of illustrated in this talk too is that the less anxious we get about anxiety, the less anxious we get. Because we just took a whole source of anxiety off the table. We don't have to be anxious about our anxiety. Just be anxious about working hard on the, you know, the study guide, or, you know, playing the game your hardest, showing up. Be anxious about showing up. Totally acceptable. Thank you all so much. It's meant the world to me.